in a balanced ecosystem, this is what Welly would often say in his scientific papers. Or, his mentors would say, you would have one parasite over hundreds and thousands of years that would specialize in one tick.
Right.
And, a successful parasite isn't one that kills.
They negotiate.
They want their DNA to be passed on to the next generation. So you don't want a bunch of dead animals. So, there was a healthy balance, and humans had, with the ticks, the diseases specialized in those ticks had come to a happy balance. And you had Lyme disease since Neanderthal, but it wasn't killing people. But what happened in the late 60s is all of a sudden 3 brand new species of tick-borne diseases showed up at the same time, and people started dying and animals started dying. And this is what we called the Lyme outbreak.
Right.
It was first noticed in 68. I don't know exactly when it happened.
Okay, so 68 is the first time people noticed this much more virulent thing and start calling it Lyme disease.
Well, there's 3 different tick-borne diseases, and the investigations were spread out around Long Island Sound. So, the different health departments for New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts all did their own investigations. And then you had national labs, because the national labs were alerted. So the CDC knew about it, and the NIH, where Willy Burgdorfer, knew about it, and they all started their own investigations. And there was quite a bit of hysteria then about people dying. And they just wanted to squash it. And the scientists all wanted to be the ones to discover the cause. Mm. So there was a bit of a competition that I hadn't realized till I started going through the letters.
Did they know it was something in the ticks at that time? They just couldn't figure it out?
So the first thing that was alarming was the rickettsials, which is, seems to be a variation of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. It's a rickettsial.
Can you describe real quickly Rocky Mountain spotted fever? Because this is an important part.
So Rocky Mountain spotted fever is this rickettsial. It's it behaves a lot like a virus. It can only live in living cells. It invades the cells. It multiplies, and then it explodes the cells and moves on to another cell. So it likes cooler temperatures in the body. So that organism will go to your legs and your palms and your gonads. It's cooler places. And when you're, it does sort of a hemorrhagic fever. It breaks open the capillaries and starts bleeding because it's exploding so many cells. And so that's why in the end game, you get these spots, red spots all over in your legs and your palms and your soles of your feet. And it just reproduces really quickly. You can be in a coma and die in 14 days if it's not recognized. In the late 60s, there was this species that seemed to not test positive to the normal Rocky Mountain spotted fever tests, and it didn't necessarily have a lot of the spots. And a lot of those people died and probably were misdiagnosed. But anyways, health departments realized it. They sent Willie out there to look into it. That and the Babesia in the mid 70s, I guess. And so they knew about that. But then on the other side of the Long Island Sound, you had Yale looking into this other mysterious disease that they couldn't identify. The Yale guy in charge of it, Alan Steer, had been working on it 7 years and couldn't figure out what it is. He thought it was a virus, but they didn't identify it in the 47 people they were studying. He's a rheumatologist, so he saw the disease through the lenses of a rheumatologist. He noticed a lot of the people had swollen knees. And so he said, it's primarily a rheumatological disease. And he sort of ignored the neurological issues, which I described when we got sick. But so he really wanted credit. He was young, 32. He wanted credit for discovering the disease of this Lyme arthritis. And it then Willie came in and analyzed the blood. And one of the central mysteries in my book is Willie actually, in all the bloods he analyzed, found this rickettsial that was unidentified, which he sort of nicknamed the Swiss agent. And everybody was excited. The Yale guys, he was excited. And the guy from the New York Department of Health, they said, this is what's causing this Lyme disease. It's this rickettsial. But then all of a sudden, I go through Willie's phone logs. He talks to a bunch of the old dogs in the military organization. And they said, and after that, the Swiss agent rickettsial disappears from all publications and letters.
And what's your take on that?
So I think it was probably it was some weaponized rickettsial, and I have records that they did have a active program to combine rickettsias with viruses to create incapacitating germs, and maybe they identified it and disappeared it, and they thought, well, we did find spirochetes in some of these bloods, so let's just say it's the spirochete that caused this whole outbreak, and
right.
We'll tell everybody to take doxycycline, which kills most rickettsials, and then no one will be the wiser, but we'll control this epidemic. And so in a way, I feel like
from a biochemical warfare perspective, something that combines two different vectors is going to be much harder to handle, right?
Right. And I put quotes from the military strategists. They said, and then Willie said this too, you combine two different organisms in a tick, it creates a crazy, or genetically in one organism, and it creates this crazy set of symptoms that no one can identify it. They're not in the medical textbooks. If you mix it with a virus, the virus suppresses the white blood cells. So normally if you had a bad bacterial infection, your white blood cells would spike. But if you add the virus in there, your white blood cells go down, and it's just confusing. And then none of the tests works. For example, the spotted fever test didn't work for this Swiss agent. So it was under the radar. It was the perfect stealth weapon if you had intended to do that.
Is there any evidence that people within the biochemical weapons industry or institution were actively suppressing information on this?
I wasn't able to find the document. Oh, let's launch the cover-up. It's more like the erased 18 minutes from the Watergate tapes.
Right.
I wasn't able to find, but the behavior, ever since I started investigating Lyme disease, the behavior of the government, the CDC, has not been open on this disease. The researchers that they choose to look into it, it's a very tight circle. A lot of them have security clearances, which isn't proof in and of itself, because ticks will always be tied to the bioweapons program. Our top 3 bioweapons before we shut down the program were tularemia and Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and they can both be transmitted by ticks.
A lot of this stuff is still classified, and a lot of it isn't. By the way, I want to just do a shout out to Muck Rock for first actually turning me on to your book, the folks at Muck Rock. And I don't know, I think they might have helped you with some of your FOIAs. And
I love their FOIA tool. It really helped a ton. Yeah. And they always give you advice, if you get stuck.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Patrick. You are. It seems, if I'm remembering right, so you have this outbreak in 1968, and this comes just like you were describing, how the programs were accelerating in the mid-60s, thanks to advances in microbial genetics. And I'm just going to quote a little part of your book here. Advances in microbial genetics had opened up the potential of manipulating viruses and rickettsias to create more powerful weapons, both lethal and incapacitating. And again, it seems like we're moving more towards trying to find a bunch of incapacitating agents. This is, I think, the case with the chemical weapons programs around this time, too. This is like when they created BZ, for example, which was supposed to be some powerful hallucinogenic that was and they tested it out in Vietnam and then maybe or maybe not in the U.S., I don't know, and on soldiers. And it was supposed to, like, you throw BZ grenades or fire BZ grenades, and then the Viet Cong would be so high and dilute, they wouldn't know what's happening. It was sort of And so incapacitating agents were becoming very much the thing in the 60s. Anyway, the perfect incapacitating agent was one that made a large percentage of a population moderately ill for weeks to months. The illness it caused would have to be hard to diagnose and treat, and under the best circumstances, the target population shouldn't even be aware that they've been dosed with a bioweapon. This would make it easier for invading vaccinated soldiers to take over cities and industrial infrastructure without much of a fight, or the destruction of property. So then you have in 68 this outbreak seemingly out of nowhere on Long Island Sound. Long Island also happens to be where Plum Island is, right? Which is one of the main bioweapons research centers in the Cold War. Is that right?
Well, it was the agricultural.
Okay.
Yeah. So they did a lot of animal diseases like rinderpest and foot and mouth disease, and they did have a tick hatchery there.
Okay.
A tick hatchery.
Yeah. Okay. So then you have this outbreak of very unusual and out of nowhere, both Rocky Mountain spotted fever ticks, and then tick disease, and then and what would turn out to be Lyme, which is right across the Sound in Connecticut, Lyme, Connecticut. And then in the mid 70s, as people are, it seems to be there's more intense effort because there are newer outbreaks of Lyme. And if I'm remembering from your book, there seems to be a weird change of heart from sort of Washington about, now I can't remember this because I focused on other parts of your book, but it seemed to be like, I don't know, suddenly they were just sort of, they were just suddenly got more quiet about it. I don't know, at the official level. Is that right? Did I read that right? Or they sort of, they didn't seem too interested in, I don't know, talking about what they were looking for. Something got a little weird about the search for it. And then Willie says maybe it's this particular rickets, which actually is in Switzerland. Then he goes to Switzerland, comes back, says, like, it's odd how he discovers it anyway. It's almost like he knew in advance and then discovered it. Is that kind of like, yeah.
So this is a huge mystery that I wish I could like have a seance and have Willie explain it. He wouldn't explain it when I talked to him in 2013, right. But they were stumped as to what this rickettsial was. I mean, he looked at it in the microscope. It didn't look like anything else, but these people were dying. And so all of a sudden in the middle of the big rickettsial outbreak, and he is the nation's #1 rickettsial guy. He's section chief. He decides to do a 10-month sabbatical in Switzerland, and he collects ticks there and finds another deadly rickettsial, and he creates tests based on this rickettsial, which he calls the Swiss agent, and he later on claimed discoverer's rights, and he named it Rickettsia helvetica. So he goes back to Long Island blood samples and tick samples, and that mystery rickettsial tested positive to this Swiss agent. And at the time, everybody said, oh, this Rickettsia helvetica Swiss agent doesn't cause disease. But now they're saying, well, yeah, it does. So the question is, it almost seems like he was clairvoyant to know that whatever was in Switzerland, and we don't know, I mean, I know where he went in Switzerland, but did he possibly go and collect ticks from an area where there was a foreign drop by the Americans or by the Germans or by the Russians? We don't know.
Right.
His partner who did that died recently, and I interviewed him before he died, but
Willie said some kind of cryptic things to you though as well that seemed to indicate that he had a heavy conscience about
Yes,
Lyme.
I mean, I would say the times I interviewed him and watched interviews on videotape, he was guilty about his biological weapons work, and he felt guilty about the outbreak around Lyme disease. And he said in so many words that I believe this outbreak was a biological weapons release. And,
he's talking about Lyme disease there. He said
not Lyme disease. He never said Borrelia burgdorferi is a bioweapon, but he was saying the outbreak was caused by a weapons thing. Right. But of course he never gave hard details. And so when I heard that first confession, I had no idea he worked for 2 decades in the biological weapons program. So my question was, he's old, He has advanced Parkinson's.
Mm-hmm.
Can you believe this guy?
Right.
So that was the beginning of the book, because it's like,
right.
He has the most to lose by saying it, because
Yes.
all of his fame is based on the discovery of Lyme disease and saying that the outbreak was caused by the spirochete. But by the time I got done with the 5 years, I realized that his original Science magazine article said that this rickettsial could be causing what we call Lyme disease, the sickness in this outbreak, but it never made it to the light of day. You know, his original handwritten science paper said this disease could be caused by the spirochete, by the rickettsial, or possibly both.
Right.
And that was disappeared.
And this then helps explain why Lyme is still, there's a certain percentage of people who get Lyme who are, if they catch it early and they get the doxycycline, and I don't know if there are other antibiotics, they seem to be cured. But there's a large, pronounced percentage of people, well, first of all, who aren't ever even diagnosed, but then who are diagnosed, and it just seems to keep coming back in waves. I don't know if this has happened with you or your husband, but is this part of perhaps the mystery that we haven't even honestly or properly diagnosed what it is? Or is the problem in the setup and the kind of the capitalist nature of the U.S. healthcare system?
So I think your first thing is right, is the underlying science on the discovery of what made people sick in Lyme, Connecticut has been corrupted. I mean, important information was left out. And so it sent all the scientists down a blind alley. They all went thinking, oh, William Burgdorfer, the great tick researcher, said that the spirochete is causing all this disease. And so for 50 years, no one has been looking for the rickettsial, or 40 years. No one is looking for the rickettsial that might be a complicating factor. And that might explain why 10 to 20% of people who get Lyme disease, and they supposedly get rid of the Lyme disease, they're still sick. Maybe they have this really entrenched rickettsial that possibly is engineered that won't let go. And certainly there are other rickettsials that are chronic and don't go away. Q fever from the rickettsial family is like that. So I say my book, I'm hoping my book is to scientists who study these microbes, is opening their minds to, this foundational science was corrupted. We need the new brightest minds to be looking for what else could be causing this chronic form of the disease. And, the tests, it's a unifying theory. The scientists from Yale and Harvard are saying these people, chronic Lyme doesn't exist. They don't test positive. And then
they learn
nothing. We're sick.
Yeah.
So there's a certain lack of curiosity amongst them, because they're experts on Lyme disease, not on the rickettsials. That's like a different field.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So they want to, just like in the Alzheimer world, there's people who stake their whole reputation that Lyme disease is caused by amyloid plaques. And now we're finding, no, amyloid plaques are just a symptom that you have Alzheimer's, but they won't let go because their whole
people protect
body
their turf.